All right, everyone. Welcome to a somewhat idiosyncratic, but I think interesting and important Esoterica live stream. Um, this is not going to be a sort of normal me talking about Gnosticism, but maybe it will be us talking about Gnosticism to some degree. But in the background of esoterica in general, I think that what drives many people to have an interest in esotericism, or what we might call alternative spiritualities, or the occult, is often born out of an experience of meaninglessness, either in a general way, sort of an existential crisis, and one wants to go in the direction of finding meaning, which is perhaps the most reasonable thing one can do as a human being. And then, secondly, I think what might be driving it is a failure in a traditional religious community where meaning has been lost in that community.
Mm.
And so the crisis of meaninglessness, or the crisis, the famine of meaninglessness, I think often drives people into spiritualities like esoteric spiritualities. And I think that there's something interesting about these alternative spiritualities: the Platonic tradition, the Hermetic tradition, the mystical tradition, of which this channel and Zevi's channel especially, and also John's channel, focus in on. And I think gives us a unique endpoint to have a conversation around the crisis of meaning, because we're going to be in like company in a very important very important way. So this is the first of what will be a lifetime of conversations about this topic, but it's the first in a series of at least 3 conversations between myself, Zevi over at Seekers of Unity, and John Vervaeke at the Vervaeke Foundation, where we're going to be sort of talking about, in a pretty big sense, and I think a pretty courageous sense, if I can pat us on the back for a second, um, some difficult questions about meaning and value and ontology and metaphysics, in a way that I don't know about how y'all feel, or maybe folks in the crowd feel. I don't get to have those conversations very often because academically they're quite stifled, and in other spaces they become so disjointed and so unrigorous in a way that they're often not worth having. But what I want to do first is just welcome Zevi, who I think most folks know, and John Vervaeke, who I think also many folks know. But I'd love to pass it to you guys to introduce yourselves, and we'll come back through and talk a little bit about some of the major questions that are on our mind. John, you mind introducing yourself and saying a little bit about what you do?
Yeah. So first of all, this is a great pleasure, Justin. And like I said when we were off camera, just the chance to just hang out with both of you and just talk deeply about all of these things is I'm just like I'm really happy. There's joy in me. I mean, we've talked off camera, and there's so much simpatico between the three of us. So for some of you who may not know me, as Justin said, I'm John Vervaeke. I'm a professor, an associate professor of cognitive psychology and cognitive science at the University of Toronto. I do a lot of work around intelligence and rationality, mindfulness, wisdom. But what many people know me most about is I do a lot of work on the meaning crisis, what meaning is, what's the relationship between various altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences, transformative experience, and meaning in life. And I also have been doing a lot of work around what I'm trying to argue for, a cognitive dimension of ritual, which plugs into some of the other work I do. And so the stuff I do on ritual, the stuff I do on meaning, this meaning in life, the stuff I do on mysticism, and also related work that I've done with Greg Enriquez about what we call extended or even transcendent naturalism. All of these overlap with a lot of the work that Justin and Zevi are doing. And so that's me, and that's why I'm here. And again, I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, John. Zevi, Gesundheit, say a little bit about you and your work, if you will.
Firstly, it's such a pleasure to be here together with John and Justin. Both John and Justin are dear friends of mine, and I really mean that. And besides being friends, are teachers of mine, both people who I look up to in terms of their teaching, their wisdom, their exploration, their intellectual curiosity and bravery. And it's a real honor. I thank my lucky stars that I've gone down a path that's put me in touch with such fine people such as yourselves. and the communities that we're building around us that are really exploring these questions with not just all of the capacities of our minds, but also our hearts and our bodies. And I feel immensely grateful to be here. The work that I do over at Seekers of Unity, as the name of the project implies, is to try to find some sort of common unified themes, particularly across the world's mystical traditions, as articulated by the philosophical mystics of each tradition. And I'm trying to do that in a way that makes sense and speaks to the modern thinking person. I do believe that there is as John has articulated at great length, there is a crisis of meaning. And I think that part of the hasty abandonment of religion that we undertook with modernity left us bereft of many of the systems of meaning, of community, of practice that carried us for centuries and for millennia. And I'd like to participate in my own small way to bring some of that religious meaning back in a way that's no longer held back in the past of when it was articulated, but in a way that can be re-articulated in the modern world in a new way. And for me, the work of mysticism, particularly understanding of mysticism through a perennialistic worldview, has been incredibly meaningful. And I try to articulate my own understanding of Jewish mysticism, a tradition in which I was born and steeped and raised, within a modern context that puts it in relationship with the other world's great mystical traditions, not in an adversarial relationship, but in a mutually enhancing, beneficial relationship, and in a similar relationship with contemporary psychology, science, and ethics. And it's I'm very much looking forward to these conversations. We had some discussions about where I might go, and I think Justin is going to kick off that next line of inquiry.
So I guess what I would ask first maybe is that we could all, in a brief way, sort of articulate what we take to be the meaning crisis, because I think that we come at it slightly differently, or maybe quite differently, and I think that the way that we frame it maybe to be helpful for people, and I suppose the way that I'll go first, I suppose, is that I think of it as sort of a loss of totality. That part of how meaning operates is that meaning is a giant system of relations. I come from the structuralist tradition, and that relation comes before substance for us structuralists. And that insofar as we are living in a world of relation, those relations form a totality, and that totality is what we call meaning. And part of what's happened is that that sense of totality has been lost, mostly through the process of atomization that has occurred, I think, since Descartes and that kind of worldview where we've been atomized. And insofar as we've lost that sense of totality, the idea of relation has withdrawn fundamentally in the direction of substance. That substance has triumphed over relation, and I think that loss of that sense of totality it's just a cascading collapse. That we lose a good sense of how science even works. We've lost a sense of how metaphysics works. We've lost even ability to frame these things linguistically and symbolically. Communities have been destroyed, and so ultimately, what's happened that modernity has been this loss of a sense of totality, in which relation, as the fundamental, we might even argue, metaphysical idea, has been, at some sense, thrown under the bus. So that's my sense of coming at this from a structuralist point of view, is a loss in the sense of totality and relation as being the primary means that we conceive of totality. John or Zevi, you want to take your sense of the meaning crisis?
So, first of all, I'm in very significant agreement with this. So Justin, I've been lately doing a series of videos based, tremendously influenced by James Filler's book on relation as your fundamental ontology, relationality, and challenging substance as our primary ontology, and trying to show how that commitment to a substance ontology starts to lead to nominalism and dualism and a lot of the stuff I talked about in the Meaning Crisis series. So there, you and I think are in very significant agreement. I suppose what I do is I try to emphasize our participation in that totality. the people I do, the work I do, especially with people, with Christopher Mastropietro and other people, is this idea of like worldview attunement. You have a comprehensive worldview, and then you have to properly be situated or participate in it. And the idea is, as we've moved into a substance ontology, and as we launched into the scientific revolution, and as nominalism and other things corroded relationality, what happened is we got a tremendously successful scientific worldview in which we have no proper home. And some people may want to take a look at a recent video I've done with Evan Thompson, a good friend and colleague of mine, The Blind Spot. The basic idea is we can generate a scientific worldview in which our capacities for participating in meaning and connectedness and the living structures of our phenomenological experience do not find a proper role. They are either reduced away or declared as illusory. And then you get performative contradictions. You have scientists claiming that only the bottom level, for example, not all scientists, by the way, but some people, that only the bottom level, the level of the quarks, is fundamentally real. And then that's problematic because it means the level of science at which science itself is done, where you're doing the measurements and doing the debates and making the theories, that level is illusory. And then you're drawing conclusions from this illusory level about fundamental reality. And you get into these very deep binds. So that's sort of the ontological dimension. The psychological dimension is that the meaning. I take a look at, do a lot of work on these two psychological lines of literature. One on the psychology of belonging, the other is this psychology of meaning in life. And we can get into the details of this, but the idea is this connectedness, this participation in relatedness, is at the core of meaning in life and sense of belonging. And I think that grounds out in some fundamental features of our cognition that I do a lot of my scientific work on, relevance realization. I won't go into that right now, but the idea is this meaning in life, it's not some sort of icing on our cognitive cake. It is the guts of our cognitive agency in a profound way. And if we don't have that connectedness that is we sense in meaning in life, we're actually in trouble. We're in a profound way. That would be sort of the psychological dimension. And then what you might call the normative dimension is the idea that this meaning-making machinery, that's the wrong word, this meaning participation machinery that makes us, that is so central to our cognitive agency and our adaptive fittedness to the world, individually and collectively, is also a perennial source of self-deception. And that we need very complex ecologies of practices for dealing with the complexity of self-deception on our cognition, and without obviously undermining it in some comprehensive way. And that very tricky, delicate, highly complex and nuanced ecology of practice, I think, is can be well called wisdom. And so what many people are now facing is a wisdom famine because of the loss of wisdom institutions, a loss until very recently of any kind of public, intellectual, philosophical, academic discussion about wisdom, how to cultivate wisdom. And of course, wisdom is not optional. So people generally try to cobble it together either within a legacy religion or without a legacy religion. And both of those are very problematic. So those would be sort of the three dimensions. There's an ontological dimension, there's a psychological dimension, and then there's a normative dimension, a sapiential dimension. And then, like I say, there's two aspects to this. There are perennial threats to meaning. This is why in the Bible, there's Ecclesiastes, right? So it's not that the meaning crisis is a new phenomena in one sense. What's new about it is the advent of a scientific technological worldview, a substance ontology, the loss of our wisdom institutions for various historical reasons that have exacerbated our ability to participate in ecologies of practices and cultivate wisdom. And that is why the meaning crisis is so pronounced right now. So that would be my best attempt to try and summarize more than 50 hours of discussion on this topic. I hope that was intelligible to people listening. and of course to the two of you.
Absolutely, John. And I think one of the points that I really like that you made is that this is not new. It's there have been meaning crises in the past,
Yes.
but this is particularly acute, and there's no end in sight. There's
Yep.
nothing to rescue us. And so the question is, what if anything can we do to rescue ourselves? And I think that's a building the ship at sea problem. And I really find that to be that is the one of the important questions. Yeah, and again, the idea that we're this is not new, but it is acute, and it is acute because of very particular circumstances about modernity.
Yeah, and I just one comment before I pass things over to Zevi. I mean, it's not only the historical forces, there's the historical failures. For many people, because of a lot of stuff that's happened in the legacy religions, the Enlightenment critique, there's been various political and moral critiques of the legacy religions, and this stuff is in the news. I'm not taking a stand on here. I'm just saying that it's there. And then, of course, you get the 20th century, in which pseudo-religious ideologies drench the world in blood. And so people feel that they have deeply ambivalent relationships to two of the domains in which people used to seek redress to these issues, the political and the religious domain. So many people feel burned, and then they vacillate. They are either completely alienated, or they dive in, as you've said, Justin, in kind of a fundamentalist overcommitment. And so that's part of the problematic too, I would say.
Zevi, your thoughts? Meaning crisis? Where are you landing on how to diagnose this? I suppose.
Yeah, we've covered quite a bit here. We've covered the ontological, which Justin was gesturing towards, the psychological, which John was gesturing towards, and now also the sociological, which is important to add the on the ground facts of how we got to where we are right now, to best assess the situation and see how we can get ourselves through it. And Justin spoke of the relationality that comes with the loss of totality, the loss of relationality. John, of the loss of participation. I want to add one a term which is central to both of what you're saying, but maybe a third facet on this conversation, which is a loss of belonging, which comes with an alienation in that loss of relationality and participation. And we feel like we are adrift, we don't belong. And that functions on many levels. We don't belong in our communities, in our families, in our countries, in our languages, in our skin, in our bodies. There's many ways that alienation plays out. It's an alienation, I think, first and foremost from ourselves, from not knowing ourselves, not being in touch with ourselves, an alienation from our bodies, which is a very profound one in the modern day. And that's both for philosophical reasons that begin with Descartes, as Justin gestured towards, and also for more mundane reasons, as the advent of the Industrial Revolution that John was gesturing towards. And it's an alienation on multiple factors, from ourselves, our psyches, our bodies, an alienation from nature, from the world around us. We no longer see ourselves as part of an ecosystem, although that is now returning, as John was saying, even in the sciences. I think it's important not to create this false dichotomy between us here doing the good humanities and the evil scientists, doing the Cartesian project. But there certainly is an alienation from the nature, from the world around us, and on a more fundamental ontological level that Justin was gesturing towards, an alienation from being as a whole, from the totality of being, what the mystics in some traditions call God. And I think what happens is, in that alienation, we're not able to put things together. We're left with, as Justin's saying, these atomized bits of moments of time and meaning, and we're not able to string them together into coherent sentences of meaning that we can then proceed forward. I was just reading over the weekend, over Shabbat, the Library of Babel by Borges, and Borges, in his famous short story, has these infinite or near infinite amount of books, and people are searching their whole lives to try to find strings of letters that they can read together. And I think that's very much a really perceptive observation of the modern predicament, that we have so much information, more than ever, but we're trying to find a way that we can put that information into a coherent book. And Borges ends very beautifully by saying that his great discovery is that while there is no order per se in any of the books, that if you go far enough, you see the same disorder repeating again and again, and you see an order in that infinity. And I think that part of what we're maybe grappling towards here is how to find a new sense of order, belonging, meaning, participation, relationality, totality, without returning to what we ran away from, without returning to that thing which claimed millions of deaths and lives and persecuted and oppressed people? How do we do that project safely in a way that can return what we once had in a religious, in a world of a homo religiosus, to the modern person without the fundamentalism, the baggage, the oppression, the authoritarianism that brings along with it? So that's maybe just what I would add to another angle here.
And I think maybe this is another thing we could lay out on the table, and this will maybe open the discussion up a little bit, is that we're all interested in threading a very complicated needle, and that complicated needle is we're committed to some kind of naturalism, we're committed to modernity. It's not that, because there's no going back anyway. Even trying to go back is a postmodernist thing. The joke that I like to tell is that there's no more postmodern person than the people who are trying to be trad. Like they're more postmodern than Derrida was, and so there's no going back. So that's not even a thing on the agenda. And also nihilism and those kinds of things we're not interested in that either. But nor or I and again I'll speak for myself, but nor am I interested in sort of relativism in some epistemological or naturalistic sense. Like, it is the case that the scientific worldview has given us things, and it has described some aspect of reality in a very conclusive or at least very convincing way, at least for now. And that's the needle. It's the say we've lost something and there's no going back to get it, and we've gained something and it's not sufficient for a good life, for a flourishing, for eudaimonia, for a flourishing life fit for human beings. And that's a difficult needle to thread. And I think that what we're interested in is sort of thinking through the question of naturalism. And John, you have some really, I think, fascinating ideas about sort of where we can go with naturalism, but also ways of knowing. And I think this is a super important part where so much of how we're taught epistemology, and I can speak for myself as a person trained in philosophy, and John, I think you have the same training, is that if it's not propositional, it's not on the table. And that we've been taught this sort of propositions are bust idea about what is constitutive of knowing. And you've done a ton of important work to show, one, that's just not true biologically, and cognitively, but also it's insufficient, I think, if we want to get at questions of fundamental ontology and fundamental questions of meaning. And so there's a kind of question about our relationship to naturalism, and also our relationship to knowing. And I want to kick this maybe over to John, to say something about sort of your relationship to this question of naturalism, and also this question of knowing, because I think you have some really deep ideas around both those questions, and then maybe we can sort of see where where the cauldron's boiling from there.
Thanks, Justin. Yes, and I want to first of all second what Zevi said. I am a scientist, so I'm not here to the scientists are boogeymen. I think, and so that takes us to the question of naturalism, and this goes to some significant work I'm ongoing that I'm doing with Greg Enriquez, a dear friend of mine. We had an entire series called Transcendent Naturalism around this, and so Justin, on both of these, I'll give sort of quick schematic things, but if we want to dig into the nuts and bolts, if we need these arguments, maybe we will, maybe we won't, I don't know. If we need them to be tighter or more rigorous, I'm prepared to do so. But right now I'll give sort of the 30,000 foot view. And then the thing about naturalism is the first proposal, which is extended naturalism, which addresses what Evan Thompson calls the blind spot, he and his two co-authors, is the idea that standard naturalism is that all of our ontology must be derivable from the natural sciences. They are sort of that from which our ontology derives. And I think that that's problematic because it does leave you with the blind spot and the performative contradiction therein. And so what Greg and I have been arguing for is what, first of all, extended naturalism. Extended naturalism is that you have to include in your naturalism not only what is predicted by your natural sciences, but what is presupposed by them. And this is exactly what kind of ontology needs to be in existence in order for science for itself to be practiced as an existing practice. So what's the ontology? You need to first of all ontologically ground your science before you then start running your ontology, if I can put it that way. And then the idea here is, a lot of things are being presupposed around intelligibility, around measurement, about real patterns, and that gets into the more detail of the argument. And then as soon as you build those out, you can give a very strong argument for something that I've been arguing, and other people now increasingly, which has made me feel like I'm not insane, is something I'm deeply in line with Justin's resistance to any kind of nostalgia. Right. So I'm going to say it's something like, a new version or a transfiguration of Neoplatonism, namely a leveled ontology in which you have bottom-up emergence of causation, you have top-down emanation of constraint, and this goes towards, just intuitively, you need to make the level at which you're doing science as real as any level below it. And that immediately commits you to a leveled ontology, and then the relationships between the levels. And you don't want any epiphenomenalisms in there. And so that gives you extended naturalism, and you get a sort of leveled ontology, understanding that the levels are actually just sort of epistemic slices from something that in itself is probably some kind of continuum, just to make that clear. And then I follow the work of Pickstock and other people, arguing that many of the things that locked us into a kind of Cartesian representationalism and removed a conformity theory of knowledge, like propositional tyranny, which will perhaps come back to, but also the breakdown of all the big dichotomies, the analytic synthetic distinction, the theory data distinction, the fact value distinction, all of these things. And Pickstock's Aspects of Truth is just a masterpiece around this. It brings back, along with a lot of emerging 4E cognitive science, a conformity theory of knowing. And if you have a conformity theory of knowing, then you get a Platonian argument that knowing these levels carries epistemological and ontological import, and they're not just so transcendence becomes what I call a strong transcendence. It's not just psychological improvement; it has epistemological and ontological consequence, and that gives you what we call transcendent naturalism. And like I said, I'm happy. I don't want to burden both of you with me going on a monologue, but that's sort of the gist of a way of opening up naturalism to something that can accommodate strong transcendence, which I take to be not a sufficient, but at least a necessary condition for any robust spirituality. So that would be part of the connection there. And then I alluded to, and I won't go into great detail, I would at some point like to, but I've been arguing for non-propositional kinds of knowing, also something that's a big trend within Platonic scholarship, especially third way scholarship, Gonzalez, Kirkland, Bruchnick, Hyland. And these are the four kinds of knowing. There's the propositional, the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. And the main argument there is those other kinds of knowing, the non-propositional, are also presupposed by doing science, and you need to properly ontologically situate them. And then relevant to our original topic, I would argue that most of the heavy lifting for meaning participation is carried by the non-propositional knowing. And this means that things that we have tended to sort of ignore as relevant or to knowledge, like ritual becomes something in which the question of knowledge should now be very properly raised. And I think ritual contributes very much towards a kind of knowing that is relevant to restoring meaning. And then, of course, the possibility that these two go together, the transcendent ontology and these kinds of non-propositional knowing, and you could have rituals that afford strong transcendence, and then you have the possibility of plugging into, well, a lot of the stuff that Zevi talks about in a way that can't be, I'm not going to claim that would be so much hubris that every scientist would agree with, but a lot of cognitive scientists should agree with, and many scientists should at least take seriously. That would be, I hope that wasn't too much. I didn't want to overload, but I was trying to give at least some initial gestures around what a transcendent naturalism looked like, and why there's more than propositional knowing. And like I say, I can justify that a lot more if you fellows want, and that most of the meaning, most of that connectedness and belonging is carried non-propositionally. And so I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful, John. And just one thing I'd ask you before we move to Zevi real fast is your position on reductionism. Reductionism, and I don't mean reductionism in a sort of the very vulgar sense, what Dennett would call greedy reductionism, but the success of reductionism as a in the physical sciences has proven very successful. And I think part of my concern with reductionism, which I'm a cheerleader of a certain kind of reductionism, is that everything gets reduced in that theory such that only particles and forces
Sure.
are able to be causal. And I think that's in my mind a really serious metaphysical mistake. But I'm curious to hear how you square the circle of the great successes of reductionism, at least in the physical sciences, vis-a-vis the fact that we're not giving up on naturalism, but we don't want to play that game of greedy reductionism the way Dennett lays it out.
Excellent. So the thing, and here I'm making use of Blackowitz and the essential difference, also some work by Michael Levin and others. But the idea, I mean, anybody who denies the success of reductionism is already lost the ticket to participate in this discussion. So the issue for me is that I would argue this way: the power of reductionism is based on the fact that generalization can be successful. And what you're doing in reductionism is you're finding the most generalized properties, the properties that are most shared by things. And that's what justifies the reduction. What justifies the reduction is if we go down to these particles shared by everything, then we can have highly generalizable results, and they greatly empower us epistemologically and technically. And that is fine, except my work on relevance realization says, but the problem with that is generalization is in an inherent trade-off relationship within relevance realization with discrimination, with picking up on relevant differences between things. And the problem with that then is intelligibility itself, in fact, even information, the difference that makes a difference kind of thing, requires us admitting that difference is fundamentally ontologically constitutive of intelligibility along with sameness, and that in addition to generalizability, we also need specific optimal gripping in order for us to understand the world. And so I would say I tend to see reductionism as a methodology that specializes in generalization, but forgets that intelligibility is dependent within relevance realization on a trade-off relation. I mean, the generalization discrimination problem is a problem you face in any experiment. The more I make the experience generalizable, right, the less I lose, the more I lose the individual differences, and et cetera, and all that sort of stuff. And so that's how I would reply to that. And again, I would plug that back into the transcendent naturalism argument and say, intelligibility and information need real difference as much as they need real sameness. And this is Filler's idea that, the ultimate relationality is that non-conceptual relationality between sameness and difference that is somehow at the core of intelligibility. And I think that's what drives the optimal gripping, the opponent processing that's at the core of relevance realization. So I think One final thing, and I've been impressed by the fact that you got so if you do the Neoplatonic history, you get reductionism upward, right? And you get a reductionism upward. And I've also made a sort of meta argument that the arguments downward and upward are completely symmetrical with each other, as far as I can see. And there's nothing outside of them that I can use to adjudicate between them. And so I end up saying something like, well, in some sense, they must both be the case. And that's why you get the emergence emanation ontology that I've been arguing for. I hope that was a good reply.
Yeah, I think so, and certainly that's the case for Neoplatonism, right? That structurally they're homologous, they're exactly the same. But yeah, I've also said this too, is that the more successful a narrative around reduction you get, the lower resolution actual data you get.
Yes.
The trade is in resolution of data. That you can get a super great reductive. You can say everything's made of quarks. You can say everything is made of up and down quarks, and you learn nothing about reality. It feels profound and scientific-y to say things like that, but very little's learned actually. It's a super low resolution statement. So the payoff in reduction is often in terms of the resolution of the actual information you're getting.
I think there's a, I don't know what to call it. There's something like a ontological, I'm lacking the adjective, but that this reduction of intelligibility to just generalizability, I think, is a fundamental mistake.
I agree. Zev, you want to kick it over to you and get you on the same, get your voice in the conversation here at this point as well, with this sort of larger question.
Yeah. Firstly, I just want to say that I'm in high respect of John and in no envy of his work here of trying to cram really decades of immense scholarship into mere paragraphs. And anyone that knows John's work is certainly in awe as well. And I hope that we'll have a chance to unpack some of what John has done over the course of many years together with his fine colleagues. And I'd really love to see John and Justin to begin to unpack the real thinking that goes on behind here, because we began by speaking in sort of aspirational generalities, and now we're actually getting to the work of talking about the meat and bones of how do we build these systems that can sustain us and sustain meaning going forward. And there were just 2 points that I wanted to point on, and John and I have had longer conversations where we've gone over many of these points together, and hope to, God willing, continue to do so in the future. 2 of them, which I thought were very important, and I'll go in order here. One of them was that the leveled ontology that John was putting forward is not actual ontological levels, but is, as John put it, epistemic slices that are perspectival, looking from either direction, up or down, into that ontology. And I think that's an important point, because sometimes when we take mysticism at face value, and as far as I can tell, the Neoplatonic system is a mystical system, and open to hear disagreements about that. But when we take mystical systems like Neoplatonism and we concretize their ontologies, sometimes I think we make a mistake, and I think this is a mistake that perhaps Ken Wilber makes, where we take these leveled ontologies to be really ontological. And I think that from the perspective of these mystical traditions, they're much more epistemic because at the core of their metaphysics is the one, and the one is not leveled, right? The one is always one, always will be one, always is one. Therefore, it is only from a perspective or certain vantage point that it seems to be leveled. And it's important to engage with that leveled vantage point without thinking that is the true ontology. And that's just an important point, which is very important in the tradition of Jewish mysticism that I was raised in, that we speak about the perspective of looking at reality from bottom up, from the human perspective towards the one, or from the one down, and how that epistemic leveling interacts with the ontological leveling, and holding those in careful separation is important. As in, there's work here to introduce an ontological leveling and then to put the caveats and the brakes on it, so that we don't take that to be really ontological and to undo the unity of the one, which then I think, because the problem with that, just to move away from being technical here, is that we reintroduce the loss of totality and relationality and participation and belonging. We create an alienation from that thing which is supposed to be uniting us. Again, that's one thing. And the other thing which I just want to point to is the discussion of this question in response to Justin's answer of the generalization, discrimination, the sameness and difference. I think that so much of modern scholarship, particularly in the scholarship of mysticism, but I think a trend that follows really all of modern scholarship into postmodern thought, is this move away from generalization towards just trying to see discrimination and difference. And the necessity to do both of these together is certainly what my field faces. That we had people like James and Huxley who gave us the great generalizations, and then we had people like Katz who told us, hey guys, you can't be doing this generalization. We've got to look at each thing individually. There is no overall categories and branches. People like Penner who said there is no valid label of mysticism at all, and religion, like all of these generalizations are meaningless. And we have to come, and it's not just in any scientific experiment, it's in any active cognition that we're always doing this. We're always both seeing sameness and difference. And John gestured towards something very profound, which is the sameness of sameness and difference, which might be a little, it might be a little too much. I think we kind of have to move through the stages here. But I would very much love to hear Justin. I'd love to hear you engage, John, on some of the specifics, because I know that you two are coming from very different priors and very different stances in your epistemologies, in your worldviews, and I think it would be I would love to hear, Justin, what's coming up for you in what John's laying out.
Thank you, Zevi. Thank you. I suppose where I'm coming at this moment, and maybe this will be maybe a place where we can all enter into the conversation, is this business of non-propositional knowing. And I have to say that it's the right way of putting it. I have an allergy to it, even though I think it's probably true. Or another way of putting it is, I'm very skeptical that all truths are propositional, but I feel that makes me feel very anxious because sort of there's a part of me that's a kind of logical realist that says that the universe is structured in a logical way for reasons that we don't understand, and that insofar as it is structured in a logical way, we'll be able to express all truths about the universe, including truths about us, in propositional form, because that's simply the way the universe is structured. There's a part of me that believes that really does believe that. But there's also a strong part of me that tries to be intellectually humble enough to say, you're probably wrong, Sledge. And also it could be the case that both are true somehow. That it could be the case that the universe is structured that way, but we don't have access to it. And so what I want to get at, and this is where our various fields come together in important ways, is that from both the mystical angle and from also the philosophical angle, is that I was steeped in logic. I was, we had my undergraduate, we had to pass 3 semesters of logic. You had to get to possible world semantics before you get a philosophy major, because it was a way to weed out the stoners, which I'm not totally opposed to, frankly. And we had to get, pretty high up there in the world of pretty, again, of Kripke's work of blessed memory. And I don't know, John, and I want to kick this to John and to you, Zevi. I spend a lot of time in the world of mysticism, and it's a lot of time in a world I don't necessarily agree with because of that commitment I have, more or less consciously, to a kind of logical realism. And I want to hear more about, if there are non-propositional truths, where are those truths registered? Because if they're registered in a truth table, great. Like that's, I can do a lot of work with that. But otherwise, it just feels like sort of like some kind of intuition in a way that my Kantian self says, like we can't do that. That door's been closed to us for really good reasons. And I want to, if we're going to kick that door down, I have really good reasons for kicking that door down. And John, I think you have good reasons for letting some light in, at least. And Zevi, I think you do too. But for the person like me, who's again very sympathetic to the possibility of non-propositional knowing, and maybe even metaphysically committed to a universe in which non-propositional knowing isn't possible, John, how would you come at that? And Zevi also, coming from the mystical angle, I think that these are two positions I'm deeply sympathetic to, because I'm mostly convinced that I'm wrong, despite the fact that there's something about it that seems, not just intuitively true, but just rigorously true at the level of like logical deduction. It seems like we have the ability to do that, and I wonder what's outside of that for you guys.
Yeah, I'd like to take that up. I think that is the key question here, and I think it's an important one. So I am going to now try to lay out a more rigorous presentation for the 4 kinds of knowing, and then I want to talk also about relevance realization in relationship to the logical issue, so. Principled taxonomy. You should lay out the principles. Or else taxonomy is just whatever intuitive list you happen to throw together for whatever idiosyncratic reason. And as I unfold it, you'll see what the principles are. So I'm going to talk about, of course, let's start with the propositional knowing. This is knowing that something is the case and it's captured by a proposition. Cats are mammals. Our cognitive grasp of that is in a belief. It's stored in its own kind of memory, and this is an important part of the taxonomy, which means this memory can be damaged independently of other memories, or it can survive when other memories are damaged. You have what's called a double dissociation. This is very important for the argument I'm making. There's a semantic memory. This is where you store things like cats are mammals and tulips are plants. And then that carries with it, a normative sense, an epistemic sense of realness, which is that sense of conviction. And there's lots of blood spilt about whether that's correspondence or coherence or blah, 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 blah. And I'm not going to, I don't need to open up that torrent. And then the idea is, okay, well, then there's procedural knowing. This is knowing how. This is knowing how to kiss your beloved when she's sad. This is knowing how to swim. This is knowing how to catch a ball. And of course, that's not carried by beliefs. That's carried by skills. Skills aren't true or false. They apply or not. And what we're doing with the skill is, it's more like, it's a different sense of truth. It's like when we say our aim is true. What we mean is we have a reliable sensory motor pattern for achieving our goals. And therefore the sense of realness in there is a sense of empowerment, as opposed to a sense of conviction. Now, obviously, I'm presenting these analytically. My proposal would be that they are always causally interacting within psychology. So okay. And then, of course, this also has its own distinct kind of memory system, known prosaically enough as procedural memory. And so you can lose all of your semantic memory around pianos and say, I don't know what that is. I don't know anything about it. And then you can sit down and still play the piano because your procedural ability is intact. I'm saying stuff that I think is relatively non-controversial. And then the point is, of course, you need some online system. I'll use some of our current technological metaphors, even though they're have inherent dangers. But you need some online mechanism for telling you which skills to engage. I noticed that neither one of you are trying to swim right now. And so this is your situational awareness. This is your perspectival knowing. This is knowing what it is like to be you in this state of mind in this situation. And I'm glad we have the word perspective, so I don't have to keep saying that huge phrase. It's the knowing what it's like to be in this state of mind, this state of attention, consciousness, working memory, fluid cognition, all your online cognition, and the situation. And of course, that is not carried by, it doesn't give you belief. I mean, it's not carried, although it will generate beliefs and it can help you apply or acquire skills. But what it gives you is it gives you perspectives. And we talk about perspective taking, and we have reliable evidence that you can have huge cognitive effects on people by getting them to alter their perspective. What perspective they're coming about? Construal level theory, the Solomon effect. I won't go on about it. And of course, that carries its own kind of memory, which is known as episodic memory, which is where you remember your state of mind within a particular situation. So you can remember what you had for breakfast this morning. And then what people typically do is they don't recall it, they relive it to some degree. They sort of they go back to the situation. What was salient for them? What was foregrounded? What was backgrounded? How were they oriented to it? What was mattering to them? All that stuff. And so this is knowing by noticing, right? And so this gives you a different sense of realness. This gives you the sense of realness of how you and the world are present to each other. It's this sense of presence that's a sense of realness for us. It's much sought after in people who make video games. They do work on sense of presence. How do you generate a sense of presence in a video game? Because it makes the game more real. And what's interesting about the sense of presence is it doesn't map directly onto verisimilitude. You can get very non-realistic games like Tetris that create a sense of presence, and you can get very sort of realistic video games that don't generate a sense of presence, because it has to do more with this fittedness. And there's some recent very good work suggesting that perhaps the purpose of consciousness is to actually afford that consciousness and episodic memory co-evolved because they give us a specific epistemic access to the world for solving certain kinds of problems that merely semantic and procedural memory can't address. Now, all of that is dependent upon ultimately what I call participatory knowing, picking up on the Platonic notion of participation, which is knowing by belonging, knowing by the way, by being with, almost in Heidegger's Mitsein sense. This is the way in which two sides of this, both you and the world are shaped by physics and biology and culture to fit together, and also you and the world are shaped by shared principles running between them. Your cognition and life are both shaped by evolutionary principles, I would argue, things like that. And so that carries with it its own kind of normativity. It's the sense of affinity and affordance, that there's an affinity for you at a situation. There are affordances between you and the situation that make your agency possible. So there's what I call an agent arena relationship takes shape for you, and you have that sense of belonging. And that's where that meaning in life normativity becomes so pronounced for people. And it's carried by also its own unique kind of memory. That unique kind of memory carried in the default mode network called yourself, and you're selfing all day long. So if, propositional knowledge is knowing by proposition, by proposing, and procedural knowledge is knowing through sensory motor action, and perspectival knowing is knowing through consciousness, attention, working memory, fluid cognition. Participatory knowing is knowing through the self, the way that self is bound. And so often self-knowledge and the object of knowledge are interpenetrating and within participatory knowing, hence the name participatory knowing. So non-controversial examples, just to make it easy for people. They're not even exemplary perhaps, but they're accessible. The way you know you're conscious is through participatory knowing. You're not somehow outside of it, looking at it as an object, and you know it by participating in it. And so the idea is each one of these conveys a different sense of realness. It's carried in different kind of cognitive vehicles, because I don't reduce the cognitive to the merely computational. And this gets me to my second point, which is I do a lot of work on relevance realization, and this is the idea that you face an extended version of the frame problem. The amount of information you can pay attention to within and without is astronomically, combinatorially, explosively vast. The number of possibilities you can consider is combinatorially vast. The number of logical implications you can consider is combinatorially explosive vast. The number of sequences of behavior you can generate is combinatorially explosive vast. And then what you somehow do is you somehow ignore most of all of that and all of the combinations therein, and zero in on what is relevant to pay attention to, what is relevant to remember, what is the relevant action, what are the relevant possibilities to consider, what are the relevant inferences. And there's a lot of work been done, and I won't repeat these arguments, by people who, in fact, some of them, like Jerry Fodor, staunchly within the computational framework, arguing, or Cherniak, arguing that relevance can't be captured by the logical properties of the proposition. The main argument, this is a non-rigorous presentation, but just to give people a sense of it, is the logical properties are constant, whereas the relevance of a proposition, like for example, it will be windy tomorrow, changes depending on what you're going to be doing, your tasks, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and this goes towards also Gricean principles about pragmatics. There's a huge argument here about why you can't reduce relevance to logical relations. And that's why I think there's an important difference between inference and implication. I think inference is relevance realization applied to the combinatorially vast implications of any proposition. And so what that leads me to say is, I think our access to reality is as much dependent, I would say more, but I'll say this more cautiously, is as much dependent on relevance relations as it is on logical relations. And those relations are very much deeply at work in the non-propositional kinds of knowing. But they also intersect within the propositional knowing. Like I say, whenever you're actually engaging in active inference, that non-propositional action, behavior of relevance realization. And then here's the final point. Relevance is neither a subjective nor an objective phenomena. It is an affordance. I think it is the primary affordance of cognitive agency. It is fundamentally between you and the world. And therefore, I think it properly grounds, or at least, no, it epistemologically grounds and is ontologically grounded by ultimately a relational ontology.
So. And John, is the point you're making, and this is to put a blunt edge on it, it sounds to me that you're making maybe a phenomenological point, and I'm asking a metaphysical point.
Yes.
And that's not to say one is right or wrong, but it could be the case that the contents of phenomenology are non-propositional, but those might not be veridical, i.e. disclosing of physical or metaphysical truths.
So I guess what I would want to say about that is, I think my skills and my perspectives and my participation, the affordances, are presupposed by any attempt to get a logical disclosure of truth. And this is kind of a Heideggerian argument. I'm ultimately arguing, I'm trying to give a lot of teeth and explication and articulation of what is, I would admit, a somewhat vague argument in Heidegger, but this alethetic notion of truth, right, I think is a deeper notion of truth. And so I do think what I'm saying is not just phenomenological. I think it ultimately is ontological. And you know, there's a deep connection between relevance realization through Dreyfus into Heidegger's whole framework.
Right. So. And so again, I guess for me, from where I come from, this sounds a lot like Mitsein, and I think you mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
That and I'm using phenomenological not in a derogatory sense, but in the very like Steelman sense of that Heidegger does try to say that engaging in the world is metaphysics. That there's no metaphysics aside from that, and I appreciate and take that point.
I would like to hear what Zevi has to say about that. I mean, I want to be clear, Justin, before I turn it back to Zevi. This is a really tricky question, and I don't mean in any nefarious way. I don't mean you're being a trickster or anything like that. I want to say that I appreciate, like I'm not even saying you're in a dilemma. I think I appreciate from where you're asking the question, because there's this tension about, because I do make a distinction in my work between the language of explaining and the language of training, and that they're not reducible to each other. You can't reduce the language of explaining to the language of training and vice versa. And whether or not the language of explaining is ultimately properly, I think, nuanced in the way I would want, propositional, theoretical, let's put it that way. And I take that very seriously. So although I'm on this side of the tension you're pointing to, and perhaps you're on that side, I want you to understand that I'm very sympathetic to the sense of that tension.
And I think that this is a productive tension, right? This,
yeah.
I think I come from a sort of structuralist, anti-humanist position that has its own limitations, obviously, but I think that the sort of structuralist humanist position, of which someone like Heidegger is a great example of in some degree, where phenomenology and metaphysics are they're inseparable. Even if, for me, I'm much more curious about yeah, I'm definitely curious to separate them. I'm very skeptical of phenomenology, for lots of reasons, but both Heideggerian and otherwise, Husserlian, and the whole project to me, I have lots of concerns about it. But yeah, Zebi, I want to kick it over to you, and I want to see where you come in at this this business of non-propositional knowing.
Yeah, I think this is a real crux of the issue here, because when we do have veridical truths, they don't necessarily add any meaning to our lives. We can know truths very well that if we were able to participate with those truths, to use a non propositional knowing that John is gesturing towards, then they would impart some meaning towards us. But when they remain simply veridical in a propositional way, they don't do anything for us. They remain abstracted truths that don't sit and affect our lived experience. And I think part of this project and part of the challenge here is precisely to bridge the ontological and the phenomenological. And this is, I mean, a classic problem with the mystics, that the mystics have a profound experience which they feel to be uniquely meaningful and ontonormative, and both in ethics and aesthetics and in metaphysics to be real and true in all categories. And yet to try and translate that into a veridical ontology that could be persuasive, cogent, meaningful to another is a very difficult process. And for many of them, it's their articulation is not even is it not veridical, it's even hard to cohere what they're trying to get at. It's rare mystics that were able to get an actual articulation of what it is that they're trying to convey, whether that's in the realm of ethics or aesthetics or metaphysics. And I think that part of this question is, how do we go from this participatory knowing, which is what the mystics, I think, which John is very beautifully gesturing towards, are understanding their articulation of. Certainly from the perspective of Jewish mysticism, the knowing that happens is a knowing by identity. It's a knowing of intimacy. It's a knowing of being with, as we've been referencing Heidegger here as well. And I think the real question is, what do we do with these truths that work well for us on the individual level, that work well in the subjective, and trying to bring them into what we might colloquially refer to as the objective, the ontological truth. And I know that John has done some work in the transsubjective and the transobjective, and trying to bridge that space. And maybe that's the kind of space, because I think in a broad way, that is the bridging of a past wisdom with a contemporary predicament, with a contemporary modern subjectivity, with what was past seen as objective and ontological. And there's a misplaced concreteness in some of that past, where we thought that these things had to be ontological, and now we're seeing them as much more subjective. But the question is, how do we bring those together towards one another? And that's maybe a question that John might have some insight on.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. There's 2 points about that. One, again, is I think like this extended notion of phenomenological, again, is presupposed in doing science and in doing your math or your logic. And so I want that somehow fundamentally in the ontology in order to avoid the blind spot issue, which I think contributes to the meaning crisis for reasons I've articulated. But that's more of a teleological argument. I guess more of an epistemological argument would be to say, I tried to articulate for each one of these kinds of knowing a pronounced kind of normativity. And then I would make an argument. It's very difficult. I won't make it explicitly here. A sort of Kantian, Hegelian, Brandom, Pinkard kind of argument that part of semantic content is normative in nature, and that therefore there is content that but it's not captured typically by the propositions, the propositional content, but by the normativity in how the propositions are disposed and used, and that content comes from these non-propositional sense of normativity as well as the propositional senses of normativity. Sorry, that's a very abstract argument, but I'm trying to make a case for a deep connection to what I would call the conceptual domain that is proper for what the kind of questions that Justin is raising. So I think pertinent. I as you can tell, you can from my affective state, I think these arguments are really central, and I would want to claim that the non-propositional normativity has to be understood as part of the content. Now, maybe you would want to say that's not semantic; it's pragmatic, and that's maybe that's where that would ground down in some technicalities. But I think if you allow that kind of argument, then you get a way of grounding, in addition to the other arguments we've mentioned, this notion of the transjective, this notion that we need that which binds the subjective to the objective in order for there to be truth, in order for there to be meaning, in order for there to be normativity, etc. And so I'm trying to suggest that there's a very sort of nuts and bolts kind of analytic argument over here, very post-Kantian, post-Hegelian argument, and it can be integrated with the kind of cognitive scientific arguments I've been making, as Zevi said, around transjectivity, around affordance, around religio, this bindedness, this connectedness that is presupposed by any truth-seeking scientific endeavor, or even any rational endeavor we engage in. And I don't know if that would address your concerns, Justin, or at least hopefully it would give you a sense of that I'm being responsible to your concerns. You may not agree, but at least that I'm trying to be very responsible to them.
Yeah, and I hear that. And I guess I'm hearing an interesting. I'm kind of curious to see where the light between you and Zevi are here, because I think you guys are closer than I am to the two of you in this regard. Where for Zevi, what I heard basically was the sort of instrumentalist idea, right? That it could be the case that we could do all the logic chopping we want, and that will never give us meaning. Something can be true and not matter, which I would agree with you. And also, you can be right, and that's all, which also can be. It's a pretty empty place to be. I've known lots of guys who are right, and that's all. They're terrible people otherwise. So that's sort of an instrumental view. But John, I don't hear that view in your version so much, and where you're coming from. Rather, what I hear you saying, and I could be wrong about this, is that cognitive science is telling us that by virtue of the way that memory is formed, that there are by definition there must be non-propositional truths, because the way that memory gets formed and the way that we know things in the world is simply not localizable in some kind of propositional part of your prefrontal cortex or something. I suppose what my concern is, and to keep pushing on this slightly, is that insofar as any of those truths are true or are articulated to become into a world of discourse in which they can be true, they're always going to have to come into that world of the propositional. And what ultimately adjudicates them is going to be some kind of logical soundness and validity. And maybe I'll point to this in a specific way with foregrounding and backgrounding the mystical tradition. Hildegard of Bingen, or whatever mystic you want to take, the mystical experience that they're foregrounding is always backgrounding and underwritten by religious tradition that says, here are the basic dogmatic structures upon which anything that Hildegard says, or whatever mystic you want to pick, they are true. And the interface there is always going to be logic. So you have her subjective experiences that may be translogical or whatever, but they're always backgrounded to that dogmatic structure, often underwritten by something like scholasticism or something else. What I want to say is something probably is happening also in us all the time, that we're, even if we're having these non-propositional experiences, which we certainly do have, that they're always backgrounded and underwritten by a sort of a subroutine of which the logical equipment that makes things true is always basically underwriting them. And so, one, there's a communication question, right? Like, even if they're stored in memory in ways that show that they're non-propositional in their experience, by the time they get into the land of discourse, they're going to have to take that form. And I guess the other question is, if they have to take that form, is that a way of vetting them? And this is a question I've asked with Zevi, right? Is that one of the things that often seems odd about the way that we deal with mystics these days? I'm using mystics as a paradigmatic example of people for whom non-propositional, non-rational ways of knowing have been transformative, and that transformation is echoed through the lives of many millions of people. Is that they tend to be extremely rigorous in how they present their ideas. In fact, they're often more logical than we are, and they take their ideas to the extreme in their consistency in a way that often is flabbergasting to us, but not to them. And so I guess that's what I'm wrestling with, is that and also there's this experimental evidence. We don't seem to have any evidence of a world that seems to operate non-logically.
So
physically speaking. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of those. So I mean, I hope this is fruitful. I think the background of logicality, and this is obviously an argument made famous by Searle, is dependent on a non-logical background itself. For example, you need demonstrative reference at some point in your system. You need demonstrative reference to gather entities together to form categories, and demonstrative reference, of course, is not a logical act. And and Wittgenstein made all kinds of moves around that. And like I've been arguing, I mean, I'm getting a paper published right now. Yay! I just found out it's getting published. We got a long extended argument. Johannes Jaeger, Anna Riedel, Alex Djadjevic, two students of mine, myself, Dennis Walsh, philosopher of biology at U of T, because all knowledge does come from the University of Toronto, is the idea that you can't ultimately relevance realization can't ultimately be grasped in a formal system, because you always are facing the act of formalization itself is always a translation from ill-defined to well-defined problems. And this is, Savage's idea about small worlds and large worlds. And the movement between those is itself not something that you can ultimately be formalized. So for me, the logic is, yes, the logic is in some ways background to a lot of our conversation, but I think the logic is, and we could get into this thing. I'm worried we'll get into the shuffle about the regressive backgrounds. So that's one part, and I think that's significant in communication, because I think, and I'll make the Gricean point that we're always conveying much more than we are possibly saying. And I don't think that can be translated into propositions, because you get an infinite explosions of conveyance. And then I guess I'm wondering about that entering into discourse, because because a lot of our discourse, of course, is not carried propositionally. It's carried by conveyance, it's carried by gesture, it's carried by joint attention, a lot of things that are actually presupposed by communication. Because of course we're not just exchanging propositions. I have to mind sight you. I have to know what your thoughts are, what your attitude is. Like I have to be able to say, was that a lie or not? I can't get that from the proposition and just its potential inconsistency with other propositions. I have to know your intent. I have to know the situation. I have to know your attitude, stance, etc. So that's what I would say about the communication. I don't know about whether or not what you mean when you say that reality is logical. I mean, there's a lot of work, Graham Priest and others about paralogicality, paraconsistency. That and I don't want to get into this, because I'm sorry, I won't beg off if we want to talk about it, but there's lots of people who talk that when you press at the upper levels of your ontology or the bottom levels of your ontology, logicality seems to become paradoxical in really sort of profound ways. Is the boundary of anything part of the thing or not the thing? And you get all when you're trying to form a set, are the boundaries of the set part of the set? And then you get Russellian paradoxes, right? And Graham Priest has just done a lot of great work on this. And Justin, I don't know, and I'm not trying. I'm not trying to foreclose on anything you want to say. I get to a place where I get sort of an undecidability about this, because I don't know if we get to a place where we lose any potential common ground. And I'm not saying this in any kind of critical way. It applies as much to me as to you. If we get to a place where if there's an insufficiency of common ground by which we could, even properly argue about this or discuss about it, I don't know. So I've said what I've said. I'm not. I will take responsibility for it, but I want to understand that those deeper things that I'm holding them very, very lightly because of the final thing I said.
And before kicking it to Zevi, I also will say the same thing. It's also undecidable for me. I'm pushing not because I'm trying to prove a point up for my position. I'm pushing because I'm actually I have a lot of doubt about my own position. And I think that I'm like, hold on, what are the actual limits of it? And for me, it's also undecidable. And where I want to fall is falling in the direction of it's much more likely I'm wrong about this about this propositional business. And I think it's a safer place to be wrong epistemologically, because it seems like because the universe doesn't seem that elegant, frankly. One, the universe doesn't seem that elegant, and secondly, there's no evolutionary pressures on us to be able to detect absolute reality. And so the idea that we have discovered the one tool, logic, by which to do it, and propositions are the medium through which all the chopping goes, the idea that there's no reason evolutionarily that we would have come to that. And so there's several reasons why I'm skeptical of the position. And at the same time, and again, this will show my own bias, is that once we go off the diving board and we're in a world in which logic and propositions are a lot more fuzzy, it's the meme, right? Well, I saw it in a dream, and I'm like, okay, well, I can't do much with that. But I know you're not doing that as well, right? You're anchoring this very much in Coxsci, and that's why I really appreciate the conversation we can have, because it allows us to push up against those borders in a way that is non-trivial and rigorous. So
full agreement with that, but I'd like to make space for Zevi.
Yeah, please. Absolutely.
It's actually delightful to be pushing this conversation to its edges. And I know that it's reminiscent in some ways of the conversation that Justin and I had a few years back, where Graham Priest featured as well. And it's there's a certain real beauty in watching the active thinking that goes on, in terms of not just putting forward positions, but really thinking through them and being open to question where we stand and explore new possibilities. And I like, there's part of me that very much likes to continue doing this. And there's also the part of me which needs to ground this back into a conversation that's meaningful for not just people that have degrees in philosophy. The Buddha in my mind is one of the great world mystics, because his primary question is, how do we end suffering? And there needs to be a point where the conversation itself is participatory in the project which we are trying to enact. And to me that's, in a sense, that is happening here. And to me, the very struggle to bridge between the divides here is in part and parcel of the mystical struggle to bridge between the one and the many. That there is that question of, is there going to be a translatability here between the absolute and the human experience? And can we find ways to ground them and to translate them and to extract them propositionally and in ways that are meaningful? So that's the two questions. One question is, how do we go precisely into that domain where John was hesitant to go, and to really begin to explore the edges of the logic and the paradoxes, and to see if there may be space amongst those edges to find the commonality, which is where the mystics do try and do. They try and bridge the ontologies by going to the edges of each one until they can find a place where they can come to one another. Or perhaps is there a need to ground this in ways that are meaningful outside of a very narrow conversation? And that's a conversation, that's a question which I'm actually not sure about. And Justin, as the host here, I think is I'm gonna put that question back to you.
I mean, I think Zevi, what I maybe hear you gesturing toward is there's sort of we've been dealing this really high level of abstraction question about propositional knowledge, And there's this flip side of it is like, okay, well, if we're open to the possibility that there is, and it is meaningful over and against simply logic chopping, the question is how to get to it. And I think this opens the door, and we probably won't have time to go through the door today, but it opens this door to ritual, because that seems to be the technology that the human beings have developed by which to induce those, aside from psychedelic drugs or something. But aside from that, ritual seems to be the the mechanism to induce those states. And John, I know you have some things to say about that, and maybe as we go to, and again, for folks who are watching, this is just one conversation. We're going to be having another conversation on John's channel,
Yeah.
another conversation on Zevi's channel. So this is just the beginning of hopefully at least 3 conversations. But yeah, John, I'm kicking down to you, because this is also where ritual and ontology really do a lot of heavy lifting in your work, and I'm also interested in that. As my wife is a rabbi, I live in a ritual world. Prayer is a big part of my life, despite the fact that I'm the most boring materialist you can imagine. I still think that that prayer is one of the most anchoring events for generating cognition in imaginal spaces, where again I have this very medieval, or a desire to have a very medieval conception of the imagination, where it's not simply a thing that generates images, but it is in fact an organ of sensation. And that organ of sensation can be can be accessed, and one of those mechanisms is the ritual of, for at least me, of prayer.
Yeah, and Justin, I think that the move you made was beautiful. I think that's exactly where the argument should go. I mean, I want to make an argument. We won't make it now because we're running out of time. But I want to make an argument for a cognitive dimension of ritual that has not been generally taken up in most of the extant theories of ritual. And I want to be clear, and I'll say this here, and I'll say it again next time. I'm not denying the sociological, the social and affective dimensions that many of these theories point to. But I think if we're going to build this connection between the non-propositional and what Zevi is asking for, yes, but how do we give it transformative power in individual and collective lives? I think you're right. I think the bridge is ritual, but I think that's only going to work if there's a cognitive dimension to ritual. This is my larger argument. To the degree to which ritual does not have a cognitive dimension is the degree to which it's orthogonal or inert with respect to all of these arguments we have been reflecting upon. And of course, on one hand, I want to take the non-propositional, like you suggested, and then I want to plug it into transformation in lives, as you said, a psychotechnology. And I think ritual is placed to do this, but we need a cognitive dimension to ritual in order for it to satisfy that function. So I think ritual, I think you can make a good case for a cognitive dimension to ritual, even for a rationality of ritual, where rational, right, doesn't mean primarily logical. It means more like what we mean by reasonable, properly proportioning one's attention and affect and arousal and agency so that one is responsive and responsible to a situation in the most sort of normatively praiseworthy manner, something like that. All right, the reasonable person standard in law.
John, could you just say a little bit about what you mean by cognitive? Because I know I have what I think in my head that word means, and
Yeah.
I think, but I'm sure that you have a technical use of that word that I think might be helpful for me and for other folks in the crowd.
Right. So cognition means the study of those aspects, that dimension of the psyche that has to do with knowing. Now, once you go beyond computational, propositional models of knowing, this will include perception, it will include attention, it will include emotion, especially if we're talking about non-propositional. And this is explicitly not to claim that all psychological properties are cognitive properties. But it is to say that many things that we've treated as non-cognitive, this is part of what's called 4E cognitive science, are actually ways of knowing. That's what we've been discussing to a very significant degree. And then the idea, if you open up ways of knowing to the non-propositional, but nevertheless cognitive aspects of human I don't know what to call it, thought and experience, then what you can see is there's a proper role for ritual in bridging between this non-propositional knowing and the transformation of human lives. Exactly along the line, I'm totally agreeing with the bridge you're proposing, Justin. What I'm saying is that my meta critique of many of the extant theories of ritual is they do not have not even a traditional notion, but let alone an extended notion of a cognitive dimension of ritual. And without that, this is my main contention, they can't do the bridging that we're seeking right here. You'll have knowing over here, and then you'll have ritual here, and then there is no big connection between all of this stuff we've been doing about meaning in life and et cetera, and transformation. So that would be my meta argument. This is why I think the move to ritual is crucial, and this question about the possibility of a cognitive and rational understanding of ritual, though how ritual is within rationality and how we can also have a rational normativity for ritual. And I want to be very clear, just like all other things, this is not to say that all things called ritual will be rational. That's not fair. We don't take that for anything else. When I say that it is possible for propositions to be rational, that is not to claim that every sequence of propositions is rational or anything like that. So I'm not making some sort of simplistic identity claim. What I'm claiming is that a cognitive dimension is present in ritual, and the possibility of its relation to rationality, again understood as reasonableness, is also, I think, something that can be argued for.
And Zevi, this seems to be also where the rubber meets the road for you. Is that true? Is that feeling right?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask John a quick question, because John, you mentioned now that you don't see a place given to the cognitive aspect of ritual in the other theorists. I wonder in Catherine Bell's work, which you mentioned earlier, when she has her sense that the ritual embodies the system of binaries that make up the world system of the individual. Do you see that as cognitive, and a participatory and a perspectival procedural cognition that she's putting forward there?
I yes and no, because I see it almost like Levi-Strauss. I see it almost like it's sort of in an abstract social space understanding of these binaries, and she doesn't have any psychological theory that grounds it. And yes, but what it's just I hesitate to make a very simple criticism, with simplistic criticism, a very complex thinker. She doesn't even think we can point to ritual. We can only point to ritualization. So I think that's close. I want to be as positive as possible, but I have a concern about, yes, but what are the actual cognitive processes at work? This sounds like more of a description of sort of the system of intelligibility used by a culture, more than, yes, but what is the cognition that actually individually and collectively that drives that? That would be my response.
That's I think that's a very fair assessment. I don't think that she does the work to spell out that aspect of the theory, although it may very well fit together with her theory, I would say.
Yeah, John, maybe it's not thick enough, like in the Clifford Geertzian.
Yeah. That's it. I think it's not thick enough in the Geertzian sense. I think that's exactly right. I do think it's also quite plausible that that sort of performative understanding of ritual or / ritualization is the closest to the cognitive dimension I want to argue for.
Okay. I just want to add to this, and this is something that Justin and I discussed briefly, in private before this discussion. That and I wonder how this is playing into your theory of ritual, which is an important bridge in your work. Is the other aspect, which is community, which is integral to meaning making, and integral to belonging, and integral to participation and relationality. And that functions in many ways, and ritual is both done individually and communally and collectively. I wonder if community ritual or community on its own is playing an important role as part of that bridging between the two forms of propositions, the ontological and phenomenological, to give it one set of names that we've been discussing up until this point.
Yeah, very much so. And again, like Matt Rusano's work and Bell and people talking about the social functionality. I am not disputing that, right? I'm going to keep saying that because I know that people are inevitably going to attribute that to me. But for me, I do a lot of work. This is one of the 4 E's, extended cognition. I do a lot of work on the collective intelligence of distributed cognition and the increasing evidence, both what you might call theoretical formal and experimental empirical, that collective intelligence within distributed cognition can solve problems and grok reality in a way that individual cognition can't. So again, I'm not offering a replacement. I say I want that all that communal machinery. I want to see how it plugs into all the excellent cognitive science around the collective intelligence of distributed cognition.
And this is a conversation I'm really looking forward to as well, because I tend to, and this is my own bias. I think maybe Zevi, we share the same bias because of our religious background, that prayer is an almost inherently communal thing in our background. It's not even, certain prayers aren't even allowed outside of certain kinds of quorums and things like that. So, but that's a specific bias I have. I want to throw up one super chat real fast, and then maybe we'll get maybe a few minutes to round this out. And this is a question I'm also interested in having maybe John or Zevi on your channel, is the question of myth building and myth making and myth telling in this. And I think I think the eccentric stripper here has a fantastic question, because I think of ritual and myth as being intimately connected, and agree with him or with them that that ritual, that myth is going to be a big part of this. And myth in the positive sense of that word, transcendent stories about transcendence, not myths in the sense of, So anyway, I'm also want to put a pin in that and say that we talk about, we get some thinking about myth as well. But I guess for me to round this out, and I want to give the floor back to both John and Zevi just to round things out as well. I'm really gracious. I'm really humble and really thankful to be able to share some time thinking through these questions with you guys. I really want to appreciate both of you, and appreciate your work, John, deeply, for the work you've done. And Zevi, your deep thinking, thank you for bringing it to the table. Thank you, guys. I think this is the beginning of an incredibly important conversation, and I will speak for myself and say it's a conversation that I don't get to have very often, and I think is chided in many academic spaces, precisely because I think it challenges some deeply held assumptions about what is worth knowing and what is worth doing and how that knowing happens. And I find that anytime where the academy tells me I shouldn't be thinking things, that's the thoughts I want to be having. And so I think we're having those thoughts here, at least to some degree. And I just want to express my appreciation for being able to have those conversations, and for the 560 some odd people in the chat who are here with us having I think a quite high level conversation. I really appreciate you guys having the courage and the fortitude and the insanity to stick around as we try to get through some of these difficult topics. So, John, I want to kick it over to you. And again, folks, we're going to be having a part 2 of this conversation over at John Vervaeke's channel. So please look forward to that.
Thank you, Justin. 2 brief comments on just to also say how I'm sticking my pin into the pins that have already been put up. I think there's deep connections between a substance ontology and a monological notion of cognition and reason, and I think that is actually not ultimately defensible philosophically and cognitive scientifically. So I want to bring that in, and that gets you into the dialogical. And then myth. I mean, myth has to do with the dialogical to some degree, and it has to do with narrative. And I think there's this really important relationship held by mythos between narrative and navigation, and how we often we take up into thought the sensory motor orientation and navigation in the world. And I think myth I think myth is profoundly at work in that, and it shows up in just the way in which even we're sort of acting mythologically all the time. I'm gesturing, I'm using metaphors whenever even when I'm talking about the most abstract conceptual things. And so I think the relationship between myth and ritual needs to be very properly explored. I'm very happy about that question. I just now want to end by saying my expectations were high and they were exceeded. This was fantastic. I always say the mark of genuine dialogos is where I feel I get to, and I hope that my partners get to a place they could not have gotten to on their own. That definitely happened for me. And I think this exemplifies dialogical reasoning really powerfully at work. And it was a joy. And I have profound respect for both of you. Your capacity for a very powerful wedding of insight and rigor, always from the perspective and stance of, authentic epistemic humility is just noteworthy and exemplary. And it's just been a great pleasure and a great joy. And I look forward to the conversation continuing.
I have to second and third everything that's been said here. I feel deeply grateful and humble to be here. Grateful to you, Justin, for hosting, and John for joining us in this wonderful conversation. I said this in private before we began, that I feel like a student sitting at the feet of two great teachers here, and I continue to feel humbled that way that you guys include me in this conversation. And I think that insofar as we're gesturing towards these truths and true ways of being, there is nothing more important worth knowing. Huge if true, as the youngins say it. And I think that precisely the work here that's needed is the storytelling, is the myth making, is to take this high level propositional discussions and tell a story that's compelling and motivating, so that we can live lives of greater flourishing collectively. And I think that's a very valid point to be brought up by the eccentric tripper. I'm glad to know that we're not yet at the end of the conversation. When you're speaking with John and you're speaking about ritual and cognition, if you haven't yet heard about the Mars rover, you're not at the end of the conversation. So we still have more to come. And I think one last thing I want to say is that what we're doing here is that we are participating in each other's cognition. We're doing this distributive cognition that John so highly regards, and rightfully so. And we're trying to use that epistemic humility and generosity to get into the mind of one another and to understand each other and to further sharpen our own truths towards that great truth which we can perhaps live by even in piecemeal. And I think that the one thing which I'm going to bemoan is that we're doing this digitally, and which is a great gift that we have, an opportunity. But also, Justin mentioned before that Jewish prayer cannot be done. Certain Jewish prayers cannot be done unless it's done in person, and in at least in the Jewish world that I belong to, it's not enough to get together over Zoom. You still wouldn't be able to say a Kaddish or a Baruch together for those purposes. And I think that that something about the being together embodied in person is a big part of this puzzle. And I think that in the Cluian sense, that the mediums themselves constrain the very possibility of the discourse that we're able to have. There is a sense that the meaning that we are participating in and generating can only reach certain limitations, and until there's a sense that we could be doing this in person. And it's therefore I end with a wish and prayer that these conversations can happen also in a embodied way, and not just the three of us, but also with the many hundreds of people that are joining us here, that we can be together and conspire. We can breathe the same air together as we think through these questions. And I think that ultimately the meaning that we generate is the meaning that we do collectively embodied. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing these conversations, both digitally and physically.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I love the idea. Again, the medium can constrain and allow for the message, and so I agree that we need many modalities to be able to have in which to have these conversations. So, with that said, thank you, John and Zevi, and thank you for everyone in the chat who's come along. And we're going to continue, and we're walking into the door of ritual now, and I think we'll begin having that conversation over at John's channel on the second part of this conversation. And I'd like to invite everyone to come over when we get that scheduled and get it going. And again, thank you to everyone in the chat, and thank you to Zebi and John for joining me on the channel to get into some heady stuff that it's really, in some ways, the hinge of the world. Meaning and mattering are really the hinge of the world, that everything else can be commentary to that. And so I appreciate deeply the ability to have that, to start having that conversation. All right, folks, see you next time for the next installment of the conversation over at the channel of Professor John Vervaeke.